Today's episode is about PTSD, and it's a heavy one, so if you're not up for it, feel free to hit pause or skip this episode entirely. This is We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling, where I give you the tools and skills you need to love better so you can live better. I am Darcy. For me, the worst part about getting PTSD is how it sneaks up on you. How you can be waltzing through one of the most pivotal chapters in your life, and then, out of nowhere, it caps you at your knees. I was 42 years old when I found myself needing a second trimester abortion. My wife Steph and I had conceived through artificial insemination. That's the medical version of a turkey baster. And when I got the results of the baby's genetic testing, it was unimaginable, though maybe it should have been given my age. So there I was, baby bump and all, being told that my pregnancy was unsustainable. My termination happened on a Friday in New York City. The following Monday, Hurricane Sandy swept through Manhattan and the East River flooded my building, leaving us without heat, electricity, or running water for 3 weeks. I was supposed to be on bed rest for much of that time, not walking up and down 13 flights of stairs to walk my dogs 3 times a day, not accepting food rations from the National Guard posted outside of my building, not posting my home address on my public Facebook page, asking anyone with a car big enough to take my wife, me, and our 4 animals to a hotel so I could finally bathe after having surgery. By the time we moved back into our apartment, I didn't need a shrink to tell me that I would develop post-traumatic stress disorder. You could have predicted it. I wasn't fucking around with talk therapy. I had already had PTSD once before and had clawed my way out of it alone after talk therapy had failed me. It was helpful knowing that I had a high probability of developing PTSD because, in addition to my own experience, the research by then had started reporting that talk therapy is more likely to retraumatize you than to heal you when you've got trauma. And I knew there was an evidence-based tool, a mental health treatment for PTSD called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So I found an EMDR therapist and I spent a year and a half working with her. That year and a half was more effective than my previous 19 years of talk therapy combined. I was so helped by EMDR that I wanted to be trained in it. And like most things in life, who you're trained by makes all the difference. I knew I wanted to be trained by the best. I did my own research, and I also consulted colleagues on who they thought was the leading expert in EMDR, and everything pointed to one person, Dr. Laurel Parnell. Dr. Parnell is one of the world's leading experts in EMDR. She's a clinical psychologist who has trained thousands of therapists in EMDR, and I am one of them. Dr. Parnell is the author of several books that therapists like me turn to every day, like Attachment-Focused EMDR, Healing Relational Trauma, A Therapist's Guide to EMDR, and Rewiring the Addicted Brain with EMDR-Based Treatment. And she's also written a book which you can use to employ the science behind EMDR to heal yourself called Tapping In. And today I am so honored to bring her to you. Laurel Parnell, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for being the embodiment of everything I want to be in life.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be with you today.
The term trauma is tossed around so loosely today. You're a trauma expert. Can you explain what actual trauma is and what it does to us when it's untreated?
Well, trauma, the way I think of trauma, is something that feels life-threatening, or something you witness that is absolutely a shock to the nervous system, like a car accident, a mugging, a sexual assault, war. So it's profoundly shocking and distressing. And not all trauma leads to post-traumatic stress disorder. Some traumas, they just move through and we're not left with the kind of symptoms. So the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder are things like nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, anxiety, heightened sense of distress. You feel like it's living in you. You're easily triggered by things, right? So those are the kinds of things we're looking for And untreated, it profoundly impacts your life. You end up avoiding things. Your life can begin to get smaller and smaller. It takes an impact on you physically. Often people with PTSD end up with drug or alcohol problems because they're seeking ways to manage the distressing symptoms that they have. It can impact self-esteem. You feel like, what's wrong with me? Often it impacts people's ability to work because they can't concentrate, which is another symptom of PTSD. Can't concentrate. They don't do well. They're easily triggered. Their life begins to narrow. There's all kinds of ways it can impact a person's life.
So, how do you explain EMDR, which is a type of therapy that you trained me in and many, many countless others? It's a trauma therapy. How do you explain EMDR to a layperson? Because my pitch is terrible. It has not improved in the 13 years since you trained me.
Right. So EMDR, as you said, is a trauma therapy. It was developed in the mid-'80s. It's been around a long time. There's a lot of research to show that it works really well for PTSD, and it works for a lot of other things too. So the idea with EMDR is that we create safety, we have a therapeutic relationship, we get to know our client well, we use imagination and bilateral simulation, we call it resourcing, to strengthen the client before we go in. And then what we do is we light up the memory network where the trauma is stored. So let's say it's a car accident. What part of that car accident is most disturbing? It's a moment of impact. Okay, so the moment of impact, as you imagine that, what emotions are you feeling? What do you notice in your body? And what is the belief? Oh, I'm going to die. And then we start alternating bilateral simulation. It can be like this, tapping either side. It can be auditory stimulation. It goes back and forth. It can be a little tactile that the person holds, these little buzzer things. And what that does is it sets off a rapid processing effect. And what I mean by that is thoughts, feelings, body sensations start to move very rapidly through the nervous system. So they process for a little bit, we check in, process for more, check in, we process some more. By the end of the session, what was emotionally charged and felt very present, like I'm going to die, feels like it happened in the past. So you no longer are living with it in the same way. You don't forget what happened, but it no longer feels like it's happening now. It shifts from what I call psychological to objective memory, from something that feels personal, self-referential, and present to something that happened in the past that is just one of the many things that's happened to you in your life. This is well-researched. It works really quickly, especially for PTSD. And the idea, too, with the EMDR is that we have a natural healing system. Like we liken it to our system of healing if you have a wound and you clean the wound and your body naturally heals it. But that our natural healing system with trauma has been disrupted. And that with EMDR, we kickstart our natural healing system. And so that's where we have this idea that with EMDR, our natural healing system, we're able to facilitate it getting back online and taking us to health and wholeness. And it's a beautiful way in which we think about it, because it's not that the therapist is doing something, it's that we facilitate our client's own natural healing system.
I love that. I will never forget. That is ingrained in my nervous system from you. I will never forget those explanations that you gave, and that it's really about the therapist getting out of the way.
Yes.
Getting out of the way of the client's ability to heal themselves.
Yes.
And it's so profoundly different from the way I practice in a day-to-day basis because I'm so active in my sessions that I have to brace my clients for it. And I have to let them know I'm not going to be running interference and talking to you and asking you questions throughout this. My goal is to be as quiet as possible and to just check in with you as you're going through this to make sure that you're on the rails. But please don't be confused. I am in this with you. I am just doing my level best to shut up for the first time in our entire relationship. Can you compare and contrast that EMDR therapy to talk therapy and its efficacy in treating trauma? Because I myself have been in loads of, I was in psychoanalysis for a series of traumatic events. Who recommended this? I do not know. But actually, I do know, and I forgive them They did their best. They
Yeah.
thought that they were guiding me in the right direction, but I emerged from those sessions, which went on for about a year and a half, 4 times a week, more dysregulated, basically more fucked up than I was when I walked in the door. Can
Yeah.
you explain to people why?
Oh gosh. Darcy, my heart goes out to you in having gone through such a terrible experience. And this is the old way of thinking, that talking about things make them better. In some cases they do, but not with this kind of trauma. So here's the idea that trauma is stored on the right side of the brain, and it's left in fragmented form. And the left side of the brain is where our language is. So these two parts of the brain aren't in communication. So when we are using therapies that are language dependent, they're lighting up where the trauma is without processing it. And so this is where you can talk and talk and talk, and it's lighting it up and lighting it up and lighting it up. And all you're getting is more distress and more distress and more distressed. And you're like, why aren't I getting better? All the therapies that are language dependent for trauma that is left in the body in that somatic area, they're not going to work. To move it out, you may have more understanding. You may be able to say, here's what happened to me. But you're still, every time you think about it, you're, you have that hyperventilation, you feel distressed, all of that. So the therapies that work for PTSD, for these trauma symptoms, are the ones that access the right side of the brain. EMDR, somatic therapies, art therapies, movement therapies, and EMDR is the most powerful of all of the therapies. And I want to say is you don't always want to use your most powerful therapy, because it may be we need these other tools also to slow it down for some people, right? So
Yes.
EMDR and art together, or EMDR and movement, or EMDR and somatic therapies, depending upon the individual. But it goes super fast because it accesses the right side of the brain, helps integrate those fragments, and moves it out of the nervous system. So you're not living it or looping in it like you probably experienced.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I love the most about my training with you, Laurel, is how incredibly creative and you think so broadly. You're so open. You
Mm.
are such an open individual. And I found it so refreshing because you were willing to ponder I mean, my class alone, there were 60 shrinks in a room, of which my wife Steph and I were two of them. And we were just spitballing questions at you nonstop for days and days and days. And you were like, let me think about that. Some of the most preposterous ideas imaginable you would think about. And then you would come back and say, you know what, I thought about it. And here's what I think. I would
Mm.
never have imagined that movement therapy and EMDR could work in tandem. But when you understand what bilateral stimulation is, which is you're stimulating one side of the body and then the other side of the body, this is not bilateral stimulation, but this is.
Yeah, yeah.
This is. You have to do it one side at a time. We do it with tones. We can give clients earbuds to listen to, and they can hear tones. We can give them things to hold in their hands, and they'll vibrate one side, the other side, one hand, the other hand. And your willingness to embrace creative ideas and fold it into evidence-based treatment is just, it's so refreshing. How did you get into your own EMDR training?
Well, this was a really long time ago. So I was at a yoga and meditation retreat in the desert in Southern California with my teacher, Jean Klein, and it was 1991. And I was at lunch with two of my friends. So here's a little bit of context. The first EMDR training was in 1990. This is 91.
I was literally tracking. I was like, wait, Francine just developed this in the late 80s, did she not?
Her first training was in 1990. I was in the group that was trained in 91. So we're sitting at lunch, and my friend Garnita she was a psychologist, and so was my friend Richard, and she was raving about how fantastic this new therapy was. And she was describing how it's working so well with her clients, and that it was moving the information from subjective to objective memory. And subjective memory is memory that feels self-referential. It feels like it's happening in the present time. And there's all this emotional distress connected to it. Objective memory is memory that it feels like it happened in the past. There's a global view. So My friend Richard and I were hearing this. I was trained psychodynamically. I thought, I can't imagine how I could ever integrate this into my practice. And it sounded so weird because in that time, it was all eye movements. Well, that day in our yoga session, which was a very mindful, slow-moving yoga, there was a man who began to behave very bizarrely. He began to do jumping jacks, jog in place, and take all of his clothes off. He got down to his underwear. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this guy is decompensating. Something about the yoga and the quiet maybe was activating him. And I thought for sure he was going to have to leave the retreat. Well, what happened was my friend Garnita worked with him with the EMDR. The next day, he was back with the group completely appropriate, dressed appropriate, doing the yoga with everybody else. Richard and I were like, this is amazing. And then we both got the training, which was 3 weeks later, and I was trained with Francine Shapiro. And in the training itself, so her language and her way of expressing things was very technical, very cognitive. She was a very left brain person, brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and very, lot of big energy. And it was in the practicum for me that really sold me. So in the practicum, as you may remember, your first practice, you pick something that isn't very disturbing to you. And I picked a memory of being humiliated by a mean teacher. This teacher called me into his classroom and accused me of something I didn't do. And I thought, that's a 5. That isn't so big. So
I know I can feel where this is going because
yeah,
I can recall spending time trying to find a 3 or a 4.
right.
So when we rank the intensity of the disturbance of a traumatic memory, we're using a scale ranging from 0 to 10.
Right.
0 is neutral on discomfort. 10 is the most discomfort imaginable. And we know when we're going into our own EMDR training that we are going to have to practice on each other. So we all want to prepare a couple of light traumatic memories.
Right.
And I remember spending days of sessions in therapy trying to land on airtight 3s. 3s that are not going to go anywhere.
Well, you don't want a 3 because a 3 doesn't have enough charge to go anywhere. You got to have at least a 5.
Well, what I landed on definitely had enough of a charge and far more than what I banked for. But you tell me your story first.
So, well, it's probably what might have happened to you. I picked this thing where the teacher humiliated me in his classroom. I thought, not a problem. Well, what happened was it started there and it went right down to an early childhood trauma memory of I was like 2 years old. I had an accident in my pants. I was in the bathroom trying to hide the evidence. My father walked in. And what was really powerful in this was not a recovered memory. I knew this memory, but what was very different was in this experience, I felt myself to be very small and I saw my father as really big and I saw the look in his eyes and I experienced his potential to kill me. He wasn't going to kill me, but my child
doesn't know this.
Yeah, it felt like I'm in mortal danger. And so what happened is I start hyperventilating. My whole body turns super hot. I am experiencing this from the child perspective that had been frozen in my mind and my body. And at the same time, and as you know this with EMDR, you have dual perspective. I'm in it and watching it at the same time. So I'm thinking, wow, this is really powerful. I never had this experience before in all my talk therapy. My poor therapist, like she had never she was just practicing and I'm like suddenly, the facilitator came up and helped her and she said, keep her moving through this. As you know, with the EMDR, you don't stop when they're in the middle of something intense. You keep the bilateral stimulation going. So I moved through this really big wave to the other side. And I'm like, wow, I processed through this really big stuff. And I had this experience of really understanding that these childhood trauma experiences are frozen in the mind and the body. And what's in there is the child's perception, including how big they are, what they know at the time of that experience. All of that is frozen in time. I did a second one in the second practicum. And right after the training, I went and saw my father for the first time in like 5 years. We'd had a falling out. When I was a little one growing up, he was a very angry man and he took a lot of his anger out on me. He hit me, he terrorized me, and I was like the scapegoat of the family in terms of his anger. So we'd had a falling out. I forget even why. And I was seeing him, and it was his 60th birthday, it was right after the training. So I thought this will be interesting. I get to check the work. And what he experienced was, oh, he's a really sweet man. And we had this really nice connection. I felt myself as an adult with another adult. I didn't even realize I wasn't feeling that before. I didn't feel the need to engage him intellectually as a defense against anxiety. Again,
Yeah.
I didn't even realize I'd been doing that before.
I literally am smiling because I'm like, this is what I teach my young adults to do so they're not on the receiving end of an interrogation with their parents. I encourage them to go there with some questions to ask their parents to keep the focus on them, but that's totally intellectualization.
Well,
But go on.
yeah, but I just felt myself as an adult with another adult, and we have this warm, friendly feeling. And I didn't have any of the charge that I'd been carried before. So I was so sold on EMDR after this. I began using it all the time in my practice. I became a consultant, a facilitator. I began doing my own trainings in 1995. It's changed my life, and it's changed the lives of so many other people. Right? Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, if you think about all the people that you have trained, the thousands of us that you have trained, and then the hundreds that each of us have done EMDR on, if not thousands, I don't think there has not been a week since you trained me that I've not used EMDR at least
That's
once.
wonderful.
And
That's
most weeks I
wonderful.
use it almost every day. I'm such a convert. Something you said a few seconds ago about being a 2-year-old. There's a lot of talk about pre-verbal trauma, trauma that's happened when we're so young that we're not speaking yet. There's no language, or perhaps trauma that's happened before we're even born.
Yeah.
What does that mean? And how do we know if we have that?
Well, see, this is the thing, the way in which I think about EMDR and treating people. I'm not looking for, oh, there's preverbal trauma because they had a difficult birth, or I'm looking for what are their present day symptoms? Do they have anxiety about being alone, or are they having difficulty in relationships, or are they triggered by certain things? So I'm looking for what are their always, it's what brings the person into treatment, what are their symptoms or problems, and then I'm looking for what in the past is linked to that. If it's a preverbal thing, an example, woman came in to see me. I've been seeing her for different things. And one of the things she had was she had terrible anxiety if she was alone in her apartment. This might link up to some of what happened with COVID, terrible anxiety. And like this franticness that she was describing. And what we knew was that she was born prematurely and she was in an incubator. And at that time, the babies weren't touched or held.
Ugh.
And she felt that this was the connection. So I said to her, okay, when you think of that experience of being born prematurely in the incubator, do you have an image that represents that? Immediately, she had an image. She had a created picture in her mind of what that looked like, and all those feelings came up connected to that. And so we have what we call a target. So it's this baby, it's all alone, it's hooked up to all this machine, and it's kind of this frantic hands going out and not connecting. And then we were able to process that with EMDR, and she cleared it. She felt, she probably brought in resources and people who could hold her and give her what she needed at the time. We did that repair. And by the end of the session, she could imagine being in her apartment, and she didn't have that same frantic feeling anymore.
So I think I'm conflating repressed memory with pre-verbal memory, because I also know of events that I've been told about that have happened to me when I was too young to have words, and I don't remember them, but I also don't, I've done a lot of my own EMDR therapy, not a lot, but a little bit, like a year and a half worth. Wasn't bad. I definitely need more. It's time for a tune-up. And none of my present day symptoms linked back to any of those stories. Does it mean that those stories weren't necessarily traumatic memories in me?
It could be. It could be. Remember what we talked about earlier. Not all traumas lead to trauma symptoms.
Mm,
So,
yeah.
this is where This is such an important subject, Darcy. It's like, even though you have traumas in your past, those things may not hook up to present day problems. Some of that stuff just moves out. So always what I'm looking at is, where are you limited in your life? Where are you not living fully? Where do you have symptoms present day? And then my work is to find out what in the past is linked to that. And that's what I'm going to be doing EMDR on. I'm not going to be doing, oh, this person has all these traumas, we got to go through and work on all of those traumas, because those traumas may have nothing to do with what brings the person into treatment. You see what I'm saying?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I also think that therapists can sometimes, hopefully always unintentionally, identify traumatic memories that really were not traumatic to the person, and then create complications as a result of poking around and digging around at the wrong things.
Oh, I so agree with you, and wasting a lot of time. And this is the other thing that I found really interesting in my years of experience, is that, an example, person can say, I have this problem. It was a woman who had severe body dysmorphia. She hated her body, hated her body. It was so bad that she was hitting herself. And she said she thought it was connected to having a schizophrenic mother and early child sexual abuse that she wasn't remembering. And said, okay, those are her hypotheses. Let's see what it's really connected to. And then we started with an image of her really accessing that self-hate. And then we used what we call the bridging technique, where we traced it back to see what it was really, really connected to. And it connected to a minor, not terribly traumatic experience in primary school with a little boy who teased her. That's all it was. A little boy who might have even liked her. It's, how little boys can be. They can tease a girl, hurt her feelings. When he really likes her, he doesn't know what to do. So he was teasing her about something, and she took it in to be something about herself. And it got huge, because then it landed in this terrible self-hate. That was all it was. We processed that within 20, 30 minutes, completely gone. By the time we went back up to look at herself, she loved her body, said, my baby, she had a little baby. He loves how soft my body is. From his perspective, my soft body is so wonderful. And I saw her like the next year. She said, you wouldn't believe it, I feel completely different. Now, this is so interesting, because it had nothing to do with what she thought it was. And it wasn't a huge trauma that linked up, that created all these big symptoms for her.
And I think that that's another myth that I deal with often with my clients. They are imagining that traumatic memory has to be these huge, what we call big T events in their life. And there are so many other ways that we walk away from a situation or chapter in our life wounded with trauma. In my introduction, I described a series of traumatic events that I experienced that resulted in me going into my own EMDR therapy, which in turn, of course, inspired me to get trained in EMDR by you. Can you explain how having multiple traumatic events, what we sometimes call small T events, like not a 9/11, not a war, not a Hurricane Sandy, but like smaller T events, but in close proximity to one another, how that increases or impacts somebody's likelihood to develop PTSD?
Well, I don't know about the small T's, but I can say that sometimes with small T's, is they begin to create constructs about how we view ourselves in the world. And let's say it's, I'm not safe. I'm not safe in the world because a number of things happened. Those things, if I think about neural networks all the time, the neurons that fire together wire together, right? And the more that they're reinforced, the stronger these connections become. So if you have a series of things that are around the same theme, that seem to be reinforcing that theme, it's almost like that groove gets stronger. It's reinforcing those constructs. And so that may be why what you're describing happens. It feels like a reinforcement of this particular view. But very often what we'll find is there's something that's happening in the present that is repeating, and it's going into the nervous system, but it's also because it's linked to something earlier. And that earlier thing went in, and it's unconscious, if you want. And it wasn't maybe a major life event, but it was something that's impactful. And then so the present day stuff is lighting up that early stuff. And that's also reinforcing it to make it feel true. You know what happens, and this is interesting to me too, when something happens and there's a feeling connected to it, that feeling passes itself off as this is important and this is true, even if it isn't true. If there's a body sensation connected to something, it feels true. So I think this is some of the stuff that we're finding with these neural networks, what's real, what isn't real. And if something feels true, like shame, when shame's activated, it feels like what's true about me. I am bad, I'm less than, even though it's completely false, the feeling is creating this indication that this must be true.
Instead of the behavior, like I regret doing this bad thing, I did a bad thing versus I am a bad person. Yeah. This is indicative of who I am as a human being.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And there's a feeling connected to that is very absolutely convincing that this must be true because I feel it this way.
That's right. And that therein lies the limiting belief that we target for EMDR.
Right. A lot of what you're saying, and I think this is such an important distinction between trauma that causes PTSD and events that happen to us that are impactful, that affect our sense of self and our sense of self-efficacy and how we view our world. So they may not be traumas, but they can be things that happen. It could be humiliations in school, racial microaggressions, attacks in some ways that may be purposeful or not purposeful by others in our world. They go in and affect our view of ourselves and our world, right? So these things go in, but they're not necessarily traumas. You know what I mean? Like,
because we didn't walk away with the symptoms of PTSD, and so we don't meet criteria for it. But it for sure impacted us.
Yes, yes. And I think maybe we need to change our language around some of these things to really these impactful experiences that have affected our lives, rather than calling everything a trauma. I think it diminishes, when you really have a trauma, when these people in Gaza and Israel who are really experiencing traumas, and Ukrainians, those are real traumas. They're life or death things. Their worlds have been exploded, have been destroyed. Those are traumas, humiliations in school. No, it's like it's an impactful experience, but it's not trauma like that.
And what I found perhaps the most useful from my EMDR training with you was your encouragement to use EMDR, not just with traumatic memory, but with events that are impactful, negative, impactful events in our lives where the person objectively understands that this thing happened in the past, and even though they've made cognitive shifts, the felt sense does not move. When I've described EMDR to clients, it's like before EMDR, I was working with a screwdriver, and now I have a power drill. Now I have a power screwdriver, and I can really get those nails in a wall a lot faster. You have, by your own work, by Francine's work, may she rest in peace, you have changed the world, Laurel. You have made such a difference. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything that you have done and continue to do. Where can people follow you and find out more about you and your amazing books?
So one of the things I wanted to tell you about, Darcy, and I think it's important because things have really evolved and changed, is what I'm teaching now is called attachment-focused EMDR. So standard EMDR that has come directly from Francine has gotten very rigid and it's more like a technique rather than a way of working with people. And so the way I trained you, the way we work is attachment focused because it's relational, it's adaptive. We modify and change what we do according to each individual. So it's not like a cookie cutter where we're imposing something, because mostly how people think of EMDR is this rigid technique that's done where they have to do eye movements. And frankly, they're teaching it that way. Most of the trainers teach it where you have to use eye movements. We create safety. We do developmental repair. So our training is really evolved. So for therapists wanting to learn attachment-focused EMDR and become certified in it, because we now have a certification in this, you go to parnellemdr.com, and we are doing trainings. We've got lots of material, training materials, as well as materials to support therapists in their practice of EMDR. So it's parnellemdr.com.
Dr. Laurel Parnell, thank you so much.
My pleasure. It's so great to see you, Darcy.
We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling is a Sterling Standard production. This episode was produced by Darcy Sterling with editorial support from Vicky Vergolina. Editing and sound engineering by Bart Migal. Our theme music is by Trending Music. Special thanks to Amanda Christiani, Preston Smith, and Stephanie Sterling. If you know someone who suffers from trauma, please text this episode to them. We'll be back on Tuesday with another episode packed with the relationship, dating, and mental health hacks that you've come to expect.